If I would have filmed this video just 4 days ago, I would have had a different book of the month. But this book of the month just keeps percolating in my brain. And sometimes our thoughts evolve. Sometimes our ratings change a little bit. Sometimes our reception of the book raises or falls over time. Well, this one just keeps rising in my head, and I'll talk about it when I get there. Here's everything I read in March. So I read 6 books in March. As always with these videos, I will group them by genre and put the book of the month last. And there are chapters below if you want to skip a certain genre or skip to a certain genre. I'm going to start with a book that was frankly one of my most anticipated reads of 2024, and that is Gaijin by James Clavell. Gaijin is the 3rd book in his Asian saga, at least chronologically, although it was the last book that Clavell wrote. Given that it's the 3rd book in the Asian saga, it actually feels like kind of the offspring of the first 2 books, Shogun and Taipan. One reason it feels like a direct descendant of Shogun, of course, is the setting. This is set in Japan. Even though it's 260 years later, a lot of the political ramifications that came about as a result of the end of Shogun are still active in this book. And you still have samurai in this book, and you still have a lot of the culture of Japan that I love so much. And there's also some really cool Easter eggs in there for those of you that read Shogun. There's some kind of just hat tips to things that happen in the book, but beyond that, it even gives you just some information of some of the characters after the fact, their demises, their legacy, things like that. So they're Easter egg types, so they're not things that are necessary if you decided to read Gaijin having not read Shogun. But for those of us that read Shogun, I really enjoyed that aspect of it. And of course, just the setting, being back in Japan, I really enjoyed that thoroughly. It also feels like probably the direct sequel to Taipan. Taipan was set in Hong Kong about 20 years before the events of this book. So you see a lot of the characters and, for the most part, descendants of the characters. You kind of see the next generation of these 2 rival trading companies, and you see kind of the offspring of those characters that were kind of at odds with one another in Taipan. And I really enjoyed that. It made me really appreciate that book even more, just thinking back of all the things that happened in that book. Unfortunately, this fell short of kind of the high level of Shogun and Taipan in my mind. The first thing is, this was really bloated. Shogun was 1,300 pages, and I would have been fine with a few hundred more. This was 1,100, and I frankly think that 40% of this book should have been cut. And that's probably my biggest complaint with this book, is the bloat and the fact that I honestly feel like there was no editor in this book. A lot of times in publishing, when an author becomes a bestseller and they became very big, they can overrule their publishers. They can overrule their editors because they're the star. I mean, Stephen King is case in point with this. Some of his later works, an editor could have cut down and probably improved them, and that would have been the case with this. And it's not just the bloat. Let me give you an example. So Clavell tells the story in a 3rd-person omniscient, which I know a lot of modern readers don't like that. Be that whatever it is. I like it because it gives you a lot of different perspectives, and it gives you a broader picture of a story a lot quicker. Whereas if you're a single point of view, you're kind of waiting till the next chapter to get another character's motivation. So I like it when it's done well, and Clavell does it very well. Even with some of the mistakes in this book, that's not something he doesn't do very well and hasn't done well in the previous books. But as an example, there's a scene with 4 different point of views, and it goes from one to the other. And it kind of sits in one person's head for a while. And what's about to happen is something momentous the next day. And he lays out these 4 different characters' point of views and what they're going to do or attempt to do in that next day. The problem is there's one character that holds all the cards. So if the one character does what they want to do, the other 3 can't do what they plan on doing that day. And Clavell lays out that character's point of view first. So you're reading the other 3 point of views, which was about 30 pages, thinking, well, none of this is going to happen. Why are you wasting my time with it? It could have been fine if Clavell, subverted your expectations and the first person changed their mind, but no, they went through with what they planned on doing. So he essentially wasted 30 pages of things that were not going to happen just for some very small character motivations. A strong editor would have simply said, let's move that first point of view last. There would have been all of that build up, and then you would have got the last point of view and thought, oh, he's going to foil everything else that these other characters think they're going to do. Little things like that. I question whether this book even had an editor. And the ending is a problem because it's quite obvious when you get through this huge tome of a book that he planned a sequel. This book did not have a central protagonist, and I don't think it's essential in fiction for you to have a central protagonist to have a great story, but I think it would have helped here. Towards the end of the book, maybe the last 200-300 pages, there's kind of a conflict that reveals itself due to certain circumstances, so the one character kind of becomes a de facto central protagonist in a way, but the conflict is unresolved at the end because Clavell was going to write a sequel. He passed away. We never got the sequel. So you had to endure 1,100 pages of bloat just to get to an ending that wasn't satisfactory. So it's unfortunate to say that one of my highest anticipated reads of the year is probably going to be my greatest disappointment because I gave Gaijin by James Clavell a 2.5 out of 5. Let's talk next about Life Signs by James Lovegrove, which is a book set in the Firefly universe. Firefly is one of my favorite television shows of all time. It only lasted one season. It did get a feature film that kind of finished the story, but I'm really happy that there have been novels published. There are 8 so far. This is the 5th one that's been published, the 4th one by James Lovegrove. I would say these Firefly novels, as well as my Star Wars novels, are probably my guilty pleasures as a reader. And this had a lot of things that makes Firefly great. I love the characters, so I just love going on adventures with these characters again. This book is set between the end of the series and the movie, so we get all of the members of Serenity on kind of this really cool story where 4 of them have to go do a prison break and break somebody out for certain reasons. And it reminded me a lot of the second episode of the series where they do a train heist, which was just fantastic because it's sci-fi, but really it's a Western. It's a space Western. So this had a lot of great things. There were a lot of great minor characters. The prison scenes were great. A lot of the trajectory of the story was fantastic. The problem is Lovegrove just doesn't understand the female characters. And I thought he botched Zoe so much in this book. It was just a disappointment. Zoe is such a strong character, and in the whole series, 14 episodes, feature film, 16 hours, I think she went against Malcolm, the captain, maybe twice in all of that. And she probably contradicts him 8 or 10 times in this book. She calls him Mal. She called him the captain, always. She always called him captain. And that was just one illustration. The River point of views were kind of hit or miss for me, and as I kept reading the female perspectives in particular, I just thought, I really want to read some Firefly not written by Lovegrove. But overall, I still enjoyed this book. It was a fun story. Again, it's a guilty pleasure. I don't go in thinking that this is going to be a 5-star read, and it wasn't. It was a 3.5 for me, but I did enjoy Life Signs by James Lovegrove. My negatives aside, if you like this universe, all of these books are pretty good. Lovegrove's Ghost Machine is probably the only one that's really, really weak. But Life Signs, I enjoyed it. I will definitely read more Firefly novels. I'm especially excited that the next 3 that I haven't read that have been published are all 3 new authors to me. So I'm excited to read some new authors in this universe at some point. All right, let's go into the fantasy genre next and talk about Conan the Magnificent, which was the first book in this omnibus of 3 Conan novels by Robert Jordan, The Further Chronicles of Conan. I read the first 3 in the other omnibus edition, and I'm just reading these periodically. I heard a term recently that I think applies to these. Someone was talking about an airport thriller. which I love that description. Kind of like a quick, fast-paced story that you don't have to think a whole lot, and you can probably read it entirely on a 3-hour flight. Well, that's kind of what these are, these Robert Jordan Conan stories. It's about 170, 180 pages. You could read it very quickly. But what I appreciate in all 4 of these is he structures them a little differently, and you can kind of see that he's experimenting a little bit. In this one, he was experimenting a little bit with world building at the beginning of the story. Unfortunately, I didn't think it worked because it was a really disjunct start, because he had kind of 4 different places that he was starting the story, trying to give you a bigger overview of what's going on in what's about to be a central conflict in this story. So it was kind of a sputtering start. But once you got 40 pages in and you followed Conan through the rest of the story, it was fast-paced, and it was what you would expect with these Conan stories. Conan is a Gary Stu. All the guys want to be him, all the women want to be with him, and, if you can accept that, you probably will enjoy these. They are not high art fantasy. Additionally, his male gaze, Jordan's male gaze, is very strong in this one, and it got annoying after a while, after about the 5th or 6th scene with one of the characters. It's like, Robert, stop. We don't need to hear about her curves anymore. We get it, If you can overlook those kinds of things, it was a fun story. I enjoyed it. It wasn't the best of the Conan stories of his, but I did enjoy Conan the Magnificent, and I gave it a 3 out of 5. Let's go next to a self-published work that I read on my Kindle, Nicholas Raven and the Wizard's Web, Volume 1 by Thomas J. Prostopnik. The author sent me this over a year ago. It takes me forever to get to those. In fact, I had to start turning those down because I just have such a backlog of reading right now. But this was a book I was looking forward to because I heard that it was kind of a classic fantasy type tale, even though it was written the last 5 or 10 years. And I would agree with that. It has all the stylistic tenets that I enjoy about classic fantasy, and I do enjoy classic fantasy. And starting off with this book, I really was enjoying it because it felt familiar. And one thing I will say, because I am going to be quite critical about this book, one thing I'm not going to criticize is Prostopnik's writing. I think is great. I think he's someone that is very good at just the written word, the crafting sentences that flow into paragraphs and chapters and all of that. I was really enjoying the writing style. That worked tremendously for me. What didn't work in this book is that once I got about a third of the way into this book, I started to get bored. And a big reason I was getting bored with this is, yes, it's a work of classic fantasy, but there was nothing new in it. I didn't feel there was any novelty whatsoever. And I think back to the works of classic fantasy, no matter where they were written, every author kind of infused their own kind of personality or something into the story, and I didn't feel that here. In fact, I got so bored with this book, I set it down for about 3 weeks and read a couple other things. So that was unfortunate to me. There's another aspect of this that I think the author frankly miscalculated. This is volume 1 of one book, and this is a 600-page volume 1, and it's not a book that ends, and this is a trilogy. This is the first third of a book. In fact, I think it's advertised like, I don't remember the numbers, but it's like chapters 1 through 40 is book 1, chapters 41 through 80, book 2. I don't know if the numbers are right, but it's something like that. And this thing just kind of ends, and it doesn't end really at a very logical place, in my opinion. I really think that it kind of needs a rewrite as far as plotting things. We start with some main characters, and then he kind of drifts to some bigger stories. It almost seems like all of those should have been saved for the second book. Find a way to end the first book with a compelling ending that's going to allow someone to want to continue this series and read into volume 2, and to make it a true trilogy, not one chopped up book. Because I don't know many people that want to read an 800-page work of classic fantasy that doesn't really break any new ground. So I always feel bad when I have to be critical about a work by a self-published author because, this is their labor of love. They're probably not making a lot of money on it, but I have to be honest with my assessment and my reviews. The writing was great. I think if you're a fan of classic fantasy and you don't care if there's nothing new, you may enjoy this. And if you want something big, you want a big chunker of a book, this is really an 1,800-page book chopped into 3. But unfortunately, it didn't work for me. And I gave Nicholas Raven and the Wizard's Web Volume 1 a 2 out of 5. The next book is an audiobook that I finished by Jim Butcher, and this is Death Masks. And this is the 3rd book in the Dresden Files series, and it's starting to get really good. This is the first one that I probably loved out of the series. Grave Peril was the first one where I thought, okay, this is going someplace really interesting, and I think this is where it went interesting. What I've liked so much of this series is seeing just kind of the layers of the world building, seeing aspects of the world building coming back. And I really like that aspect of it because we saw in the first book, we got a lot of glimpses of just Chicago as a story. And we got kind of the mafia member coming back in this story. We saw some real world application. This is about the Shroud of Turin has been stolen and Harry has to find it. And then we get some of the characters back. One of my favorite side characters at this point of the series is Michael, who was in Grave Peril, and he's back in here. And there's a lot of just things of a revelatory nature that I enjoyed in this story. There's some fantastic secondary characters that are introduced in this book. And I felt the stakes were higher because the first time that something major happened to a secondary character, I actually felt something. And I hadn't felt that so far. So I'm really excited with this series. You will see one more book from me next month. I did listen to the 6th book of the Dresden Files, and I'll talk about that next month in my wrap-up. But I'm starting to get to where everyone says it starts to get good in the series, and I'm just so excited for it because I'm really enjoying it. And I'm enjoying these audiobooks. James Marsters is a fantastic audiobook narrator. He just brings the story alive, and I think adds an element to Harry that I wasn't getting, at least in the early books when I was reading it with my eyes. But I did really, really enjoy Death Masks by Jim Butcher. I gave it a 5 out of 5. My book of the month is The Lonesome Crown by Brian Lee Durfee. So listen, this book it wasn't originally my favorite of the series, and it wasn't originally my book of the month, but I can't stop thinking about it. And there's certain aspects of this book that just have been grabbed by my brain, and I just keep thinking about it, and it just kept raising. My 4.5 original rating is now up to a 5, and this superseded Death Masks as my book of the month. So let me talk about this. I can't talk a lot of specifics because this is the 3rd book of the 5 Warrior Angels trilogy. So I can't talk a lot of specifics, but I can tell you what made this book great for me. First of all, at the end of the 2nd book, we had a big battle. And what resulted at the end of this battle was very far-flung, is a lot of these characters who had been together for really 2 books are now separated and spread out all over the continent. And what you start to see is you start to see some of these characters converge with other characters that they hadn't been with before. And the result was in the point of view chapters, you got to see a lot of these characters from different people, and it resulted in just kind of a different perspective of these characters. And I think for the first time, Nail, we talked about in our live streams how he was kind of a mid-protagonist, seeing him from some different eyes rather than the people that have known him from Gallows Haven all the way from the beginning, I started to like this character. And actually, there's a scene at the end. All I'll say is he slaps another character where immediately I was Team Nail. We'll talk about it in the live stream, which is going to be next week. Stay tuned for that. But seeing a lot of these characters just interact with different characters, for me, brought a lot more depth and a lot more nuance to these characters that you didn't see because you saw them through the same eyes for so much. So I enjoyed that aspect of it. Additionally, this is the finale, so you saw a lot of the convergence of not just characters, but storylines, and you finally saw the big reveal of what was going on. For 2.5, or even a little further on in this series, Durfee's just been totally subverting all your expectations, misdirecting you different ways, with glee, as we say, and you finally got the big reveal, and I thought it was brilliant. I can understand why Some people might not like it, but I loved it. I thought it was such a fantastic way of looking at it. And it's something that made you really think about everything that happened before. And when we got to the epilogues, it made me think about it even more. The other thing that this book does really well is it drives home the fact that this has been a series that's really been about a holy war. It's been about a religious conquest. And you get a lot of discussions from a lot of different characters who have different ideas of religion. Some people are non-religious, and you get a lot of just really interesting discussions in here, driving home that theme, which was, purveying the series, but I think really came to the front of the story in this. There's a 200-page battle sequence in here, which for me would usually be exhausting, but Durfee broke it up into some pretty short chapters, which made it flow pretty well. I'm still not the biggest fan of a battle sequence, at least a very long one. For instance, if somebody tells me a work of fantasy has great character work, I'm like, ooh, I want to read that. If they say, oh, it has this great battle, I'm like, whatever. Not my thing, but it was done very well, and it was done a little differently. It felt very, very fast-paced, even though it was 200 pages. And I would say that's true about this book. This is about 1,100 pages, but this read very, very fast. So if you're someone looking at these books and you want to read these, despite the heft, they go down really, really quickly. Durfee's writing style for me is a lot like Robert Jordan's. It's very accessible. It can be a little repetitive at times, but I don't mind that. I don't mind being reminded certain things by authors. And because of that, I think it does flow pretty quickly. If there's one thing that I would say to detract from this book is I did feel that it was maybe a little too fast. And I wanted to kind of sit in some of these character moments and experience them a little bit more deeply. I think, and I'll ask him at some point, I hope to have him on the channel. I will ask him about that because I really feel that when he had to cut down the series from his planned 5 books to a 3-book series, although 3 huge chunky books, I do feel that he probably had to speed a few things up. That's probably my biggest complaint with that. Actually, my biggest complaint has nothing to do with this book. My biggest complaint is with Simon & Schuster's Saga Press, because this is probably the worst edited book I've ever read. There are so many typos. There were so many grammatical errors. There's so many proofreading errors. I generally have an eye for those things. Like if I'm reading a self-pub novel and I notice one, I often will ping the author, let them know, because they can often change it if they're publishing print by demand, things like that. But there were so many, there were scenes where characters were talking that were on the other side of the continent. And frankly, his editor should be fired. This is such a poorly edited book. It was appalling to me. I don't blame the author for that because there's people that it's their job to do that. And the people whose job at Simon & Schuster Saga Press, who Durfee has put on the map for fantasy readers, frankly, didn't do their job. And I hope someone sees this and maybe reevaluates their process because it was done very, very poorly in this book. I don't know how many times Tala was written as T-A-L. Anyway, I got to talk about the ending. The ending was magnificent, both the last chapter and the 3 epilogues. The 3 epilogues gave us so much closure, and I really enjoyed that aspect of it. But what I love most, and this is what just keeps sticking in my head about this book, is every chapter in all 3 of these books starts with an epigraph, which was written from some historic or religious text. And in this epilogue, you get 3 new historic texts. And you find out in the last chapter what they're all about. And it was so brilliant too. The character that tells you about it, it was so brilliant thematically. It ties everything together. And then it makes you really think about the grand conclusion of this book and everything that went before it. It was so superbly done. So this is a book that the more I think about it, the more I love this book. It's not perfect. I would say objectively, The Blackest Heart is probably the superior novel in the series, but I really enjoyed this book. I enjoyed this series. If you're looking for epic fantasy, people complain that there's not epic fantasy anymore. You get about 3,000 pages by Brian Lee Durfee. It's worth your time. The Lonesome Crown by Brian Lee Durfee is my book of the month, March 2024. 5 stars. Well, that was my month. I talked a lot. I only read 6 books, but there were a lot of things I had to say about all of these books. I hope that you enjoyed this wrap-up. I hope that you had a great month. I'd love to hear what your best book of the month was. Let me know in the comments below. And of course, if you've read any of these, I'd love to talk with you about them. Just label any spoilers if you want to talk spoilers. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Goodreads, and the Fireside Discord. I'd love to interact with you in those places. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.